Hey there, friends. I started this series with the intent of making it a mini series with no more than 6 episodes. That all changed, though, once I received my FOIA request from the DA. I knew I had to do more in order to do this story justice. We received hundreds of hours of audio and video, as well as thousands of pages of court and police records. So, this case will be the first long term serial for True Consequences, and for me. I hope that you enjoyed this special series and that it opens up the conversation about child abuse and child safety. This podcast deals with themes and topics that may not be suitable for young audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Before we get into this episode, I have some people that I need to thank. First, I need to thank Jessica Alvarez Campion for your generous donation on ko-fi/true consequences. Your support means so much to me, and I appreciate it more than you know. I also need to thank Elizabeth Marley Hollingsworth, Karen Metz, Sweet Vicious, Raylene Knight, as well as Katie Silva Garcia for being our newest patron subscribers. If you want to support this show, go to patreon.com/true consequences. I also need to thank my research and writing team, as well as the voice talent that have loaned me their voices for this series. First, I need to thank Jackie Moranty for her incredible help with research, as well as helping me to write this season. She also does some voiceover work throughout the series, so I hope you enjoy hearing her. And if you like her, go listen to both of her shows. One is called Cause of Death, Epidemiology Throughout History, and the other is Lucky Charms Unplugged. Now, I'm partial to Cause of Death. It's one of my favorite shows. I think it's very underrated, and I strongly encourage you to go listen to it and learn all about the pandemics of the past, present, and future. I also need to thank JT Hosack from Brew Crime. JT has helped to write some of the episodes in this series, as well as provided a voice for some of the people throughout the story. Finally, I want to thank CJ from Beyond the Rainbow podcast, another one of my favorites. CJ has also lent me her voiceover talents, and I am very grateful for you, CJ. Thank you very much. Okay, that's enough blabbing from me. Let's get into this series. Divorce is a nasty business. It takes all your insecurities and fears and magnifies them in front of the court. It exposes the best and worst of all of us. Now, divorce with children is even messier and more traumatizing than divorce without children. Custody battles can often lead parents to their breaking point. I know firsthand, as I went through an ugly custody battle several years ago. It was one of the worst experiences of my life, and I never want to relive that again. Now, you may have heard that 50% of all marriages end in divorce, and this is still somewhat true. However, more recently, the percentage has been declining, mostly due to a decrease in the number of marriages in general. It seems people are waiting longer to get married, and thus, the rate of divorce is also decreasing. There are countless tales about these types of court battles leading to extreme violence, and this case, unfortunately, is one of those examples. My name is Eric Carter-Landin, and this is Season 5 of True Consequences, Negligence, the Dylan Redwine story. Mark Redwine and Elaine Hatfield were married in 1991. The pair had 2 boys, Cory and Dylan. Mark and Elaine had their challenges as a couple and eventually decided to divorce in 2005. Later, the couple decided to give it another try, around 2008. But then, after an incident on the 4th of July, the couple decided to complete their divorce. Proceedings in court were completed in August of 2009. And this process was not an easy one. It has led to one of the most diabolical cases of child abuse in Bayfield, Colorado. But this is not where our story begins. The story begins in the middle of an intense custody battle between Mark Redwine and Elaine Hall. Now, I'm starting here because I believe that this custody battle was one of the major toppled dominoes that led to the tragic end of a young man's life. I want to take you back almost 10 years ago. The story starts on the morning of September 21st, 2012. Mark, Elaine, and Dylan were all in court for a hearing on custody and child support related to the divorce that was finalized in 2009. It was not an easy divorce. Both Mark and Elaine did not trust each other, and so the custody fight was just ramping up on this early fall morning in 2012. One of the first things that comes up in the transcript of the court proceeding was the fact that there was some disagreements about sharing financial and work information. Elaine claimed that Mark had been calling her previous employer and having inappropriate conversations with them. She requested the court not share her current employer information to prevent any further inappropriate contact. The tension in the courtroom was so intense that the court asked Dylan to step outside for a few minutes. Mark's lawyer tried to argue that Elaine had brainwashed Dylan to be against his father. Here's a quote from the transcript.
Mr. Redwine hasn't had much time to spend with his child, and is afraid that Dylan has been, for lack of a better term, brainwashed at this point. And I'm not using it as the strictest sense of the word, of course. I'm just using it to illustrate what I mean. So we're afraid that he's been influenced, strongly influenced, and that what he's going to say to you isn't going to be really what's of his mind.
The judge dismissed the objection and proceeded to interview Dylan alone. The detail of this conversation between Honorable David L. Dickinson and Dylan Redwine was sealed by the court. Now, it was sent to me as part of the FOIA request, and I am choosing to summarize the conversation rather than include it in this episode. I decided this for two reasons. Number one, Dylan was only 13 when he gave this statement. And number two, I just don't feel like it's appropriate. Essentially, Dylan told the judge that he was happy at his new school. He loved being in the Monument/Colorado Springs area, and he said that he wanted to be with his mom full time. After speaking with Dylan, the judge said, quote, "I will say that Dylan seems to be a very nice young man, very courteous and a good attitude. I will also say that, as is apparently the case in most cases, Dylan seems to be relatively unaffected by the divorce, or at least dealing with it well, I should say. And the parents may be interested to know that research shows that kids are remarkably resilient when it comes to dealing with these things, even in highly conflicted cases. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd give this about a 4 or 5, probably in terms of conflict between the parties. So at least based on my untrained observation, and I will tell you, I'm an engineer, not a psychologist, I think Dylan is doing pretty well." That's the good news. 4 out of 5 on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of messy divorces. The events that followed and that we will discuss in future episodes will prove that this was a powder keg waiting for the slightest spark to set it off. On a scale of 1 to 10, this would eventually become a level 10 conflict. Dylan was then taken to lunch by his brother while his mom, Elaine, was questioned by her attorney.
You are here because you filed a motion to relocate Dylan, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell the court why you relocated to, I guess originally to Florence, and now you're out in the Springs? Can you explain to the court what happened and what led up to your move?
Well, there were several factors. One, we really didn't, after the court made its decision about the house, we really didn't have a place to go at that point here in the area. And my mother is very ill, and I needed to be closer to her. My support network, I had no one here in Durango, and it was very difficult to maintain.
And when you moved up there at the end of July, or I'm sorry, at the end of June, you actually had to be out of your residence by June 30th?
Yes.
Elaine went on to describe that her mother was terminally ill and that she wanted to be closer to her mom. She was asked by her attorney how Dylan was doing in school. Elaine stated that he had no missing assignments and that he seemed to be adjusting well. She was asked about who made the arrangements for Mark and Dylan to spend time together, and she explained that Mark made the arrangements directly with Dylan using the phone that she bought Dylan. She said she was tired of being the intermediary between them and wanted Mark to be able to speak with Dylan whenever he wanted without having to go through her. The questioning continued.
Has there ever been an instance where Dylan's phone was turned off temporarily?
Yes,
And why was that?
because I couldn't pay the bill.
And as far as your financial situation, do you make sure that Dylan has Dylan always had a home to live in?
Yes,
And has he always had food on the table? Has he ever gone hungry?
no,
And who buys his school clothes?
I do.
Who buys his school supplies?
I do.
Who pays for all the food that he eats?
I do.
Do you receive any child support?
No,
Do you pay child support?
I do.
You pay child support to Mr. Redwine?
Uh-huh.
Yes, you heard that correctly. Despite paying for Dylan's food, housing, clothing, and any other need that he may have, Elaine was still paying child support to Mark, even though Mark lived in another county and rarely saw Dylan for extended periods of time.
Has Mr. Redwine ever provided you with did he ever send you any kind of checks?
He did.
And how many has he sent you over the years?
One. Well, he sent me one, and I think that's it. But yeah, I think it's just the one.
And that one that he sent you? What was that? What was the purpose of that check?
On the check, it said reimbursement of child support.
So he hasn't provided you with any finances to pay any of your bills or...
Not directly, no.
Do you know why Mr. Redwine is objecting to your relocation?
I've got my own opinions, but I don't know, specifically why he would object. I mean, if he'd listened to Dylan, he would, see that Dylan is happy and that's where he wants to be.
And since the court granted your motion to enroll Dylan in school, and actually since you moved up to the Colorado Springs, Florence area in, I guess it would be the 1st of July, how many times has Mr. Redwine seen Dylan?
Twice.
Twice. Do you know when that was?
He took him on vacation. I believe that was the 1st of August, and then he saw him again over Labor Day.
What would you request? What are you asking the court to do today?
Well, I'd like to retain or keep Dylan in the environment that he's comfortable with, which is with me in the Colorado Springs area.
And as far as the visitation, what would you propose visitation be for Mr. Redwine?
I think a lot of this has to do with Dylan. He certainly has an opinion, and he's able to, communicate directly with his father. I'm pretty much open to anything that those two can work out. I think it's important for Dylan to spend time with his dad, too. But I think that it's also got to be on Dylan's terms as well. It's not always about, what Mark wants. I think it's got to be about what Dylan wants as well. And I think sometimes that gets lost.
Now, it's important to understand why this whole issue came up in the fall of 2012. Elaine needed to move closer to her family for a number of reasons. The first reason, her mother was terminally ill. The second reason was that she didn't have a support system in the Durango area. Thirdly, she could not afford to live in the Durango area. And finally, she traveled for work while in Durango. And because of this, Dylan missed some school. Once she moved, she was able to lean on family to help with Dylan. Mark's lawyer tried to make it seem like Elaine wasn't consulting with Mark on childcare and not offering him the chance to watch Dylan while she traveled for work. On redirect, Elaine's lawyer clarified that she had tried to get Mark to spend more time with Dylan through the court, though he never did. Elaine's lawyer brought up an incident that occurred between Cory and Mark. Mark's lawyer tried to paint this in a light that made Cory look bad. When Elaine's lawyer asked about it, the court learned that Cory saw his dad having sex with a family friend outside the house and confronted him. Elaine was asleep in the marital bed at the time. Mark got angry at being confronted, and when Elaine heard the commotion, she confronted Mark and he pushed her. Cory then started fighting with Mark. Elaine said it was because he pushed her that Cory got physical with him. After a short lunch recess, Mark's lawyer called him to the stand for questioning. The court asked Mark why he objects to the motion to give Elaine custody of Dylan. It's important to note that Dylan is already established at his new school near Monument, Colorado, and Mark is asking to be awarded custody even though he lives near Durango, which is 330 miles away, or nearly a 6-hour drive. Durango is actually closer to New Mexico than it is to the Colorado Springs area.
Well, right now I would like the court to consider having Dylan placed into my custody until professional evaluations can be done to determine what Mrs. Redwine and I don't agree upon, and truly what's in his best interests. And we'll talk. So you're asking the court to give you parenting time with Dylan at a minimum during the school year? Yes. Now, have you been active in Dylan's life? Every opportunity I have to spend with Dylan, I spend with him. He's my first priority, and any time I can be available to spend with him, I make every effort to make that happen. How so? Well, any time that I'm coming into town, because obviously with all the economy that's been suffered in this area and my inability to earn an income substantial enough to, meet my mortgage obligations, pretty much I've been forced to work out on the road. So my point is that any time that I can spend with Dylan and contribute to the welfare of Dylan, I do so at every opportunity. Now, where do you work? I work for United Pipeline Company. And where is your job? Does your job require you to work geographically? Well, the company, U.S. headquarters are right here in Durango, but unfortunately, the majority of the work that we have is not in this area, so it can be in Texas. It can be in California, it can be in Idaho, it can be in Pennsylvania, it can be in California, and even in Canada sometimes. We're an international company, so there's work all over the world that we do. I choose not to do any of the work outside the U.S. because I want to be within 24 hours of Dylan if he ever needed me for anything. What about, where do you work geographically now? Well, right now I've been working in Cortez, as I'm in the process of seeking local employment to ensure that I have the ability to care for Dylan in the event that the court saw fit to place him into my custody.
Mark was then asked about the divorce and how long it had been in process. That's when he brought up the events of the infamous July 4th barbecue. Here is what he said about it.
It was July 4th weekend, but I'm not exactly... Could have been a different year, is what you're saying? Possible. I'm thinking it was in 2008, but it could have been in 2009. Alright, so let's just take us through that. Where were you? What were you doing? That type of thing. Well, we had some friends from the Colorado Springs area that came over, and they had brought some friends of theirs that I didn't know. We had spent all day rafting down the river here in Durango, and after we all got out of the river, we decided to grab, things to cook on the grill at the house. So some of us segregated and went shopping for food. Some of us went to the liquor store and purchased liquor. At that point, we got back to the house and we were cooking hamburgers and pork chops and a variety of other things. Okay. Later on, at some point that night, I heard my oldest son screaming and hollering, and when I got up, I followed him into the house. As soon as I came through the front door and made it to the entryway of the bedroom, that was the last thing I remember. I was struck in the face with a baseball bat that Miss Redwine kept next to the bed. It is a baseball bat that was kept where? She kept it next to the bed, and I remember that because I had laughingly joked about it, because it was just a little t-ball bat, and I had laughed about, her ability to actually defend herself with it, but as it turned out to be quite a weapon. Do you know who hit you? Do I personally know who hit me? Yes, I do. And how do you know that? Because the last thing I remember was being in front of Mrs. Redwine, and my son was nowhere to be found. And I know. And where were you standing? And I was standing in the doorway to her bed, probably 3 feet away from her. 2 feet away from her at that time. And I know that she lunged at my pants because she was trying to determine whether or not I was having sex with another woman, which be kind of hard to do if you had your pants on, I would think. But the last thing I remember was being in front of her and waking up 10 or 12 hours later on the love seat of the couch in the living room. Okay, so you were actually facing Mrs. Redwine? Yes, I was. You weren't facing any other person. There was nobody else in the room, to my knowledge. It was me and Mrs. Redwine. And this was in you said her bedroom. I'm just going to have to assume, was that the master bedroom? This is the entryway to the master bedroom, which was several feet away from her bed, so we were within 2 feet of each other. Now, you mentioned about waking... You just said this. You mentioned about waking up 10 or 12 hours later. Can you explain what you meant by that? Well, at some point I woke up from being unconscious, and, I felt a little funny for several reasons, but one of which, something that didn't seem right with my face. So I walked down the hall to the bathroom, and when I looked in the mirror and discovered what had happened to me, the first words out of my mouth was, "Who is responsible for this?" So you were actually knocked unconscious for how long? The incident occurred between Mrs. Redwine and I somewhere around or shortly after midnight, and it was probably 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock the following morning that I woke up. Had anybody called an ambulance for you? No. Did you go to the hospital? I did later. I managed to make my way home when I called the sheriff's department, and upon the deputy arriving at my home, immediately called the paramedics and had me taken to the hospital.
Clearly, there are discrepancies between Elaine and Mark's recollection of the events of July 4th. I know from firsthand experience that sometimes these custody battles lead people to say and do things that they may not normally do. These situations can also cause people to lie in order to hurt the other party. Unfortunately, without having firsthand experience with the actual events of July 4th, 2008, it's impossible to know exactly what happened. I only share this to give you context into the intensity and serious nature of this particular custody battle. Mark starts making accusations about Elaine using drugs and drinking. He also claims to be the person who is the victim in this situation. He continues to paint Elaine and Cory in a negative light. Finally, the answer to this question just didn't sit right with me. For context, Mark was just explaining why he would be a better parent to have full custody of Dylan to the court. His lawyer asked him this question.
Now, have you thought about, again, 13, they can get into alcohol and drugs, who knows? But have you thought about how you would deal with those types of issues? Well, I think that with Dylan, I think at this point, given the fact there's violent behavior that's been taking place in Mom's house, there's been more than one occasion where I've addressed discourse specifically about the use of alcohol as it relates to our children, and the fact that I'm finding things in both my house and now I'm finding them in the house that Mrs. Redwine lived in that corresponds to the problem doesn't just lie in one residence. It's wherever it wants to be, And I question how much of this involves Mrs. Redwine and how much of it involves our son, and, are they both participating in it? Where are we at with that? My point is, I believe that counseling is a good way to address these issues and bring in a more professional manner the problems that are being developed over time.
There seems to be a lot of finger pointing from Mark to Elaine and Cory, and I cannot pretend to know the truth here. But the root of the question being asked was how he would address these issues if he had Dylan full time. His first instinct is to start talking about Elaine and Cory. After being pressed further, he states that he would drug test Dylan at his home. Now, the issue is raised that Dylan missed 34 days of school in the 7th grade, which was the year before this hearing. Mark uses this again to claim that he would be the better parent to be with. There is also discussion about a vacation that Mark and Dylan took together, and Mark claims that Dylan was texting Cory about moving alcohol from the house before they got back from vacation. Mark goes on to say that Dylan has an attitude problem and that he's difficult to handle. Finally, it's time for Elaine's lawyer to question Mark.
As with respect to the incident that occurred on July 4th,
Yeah?
you indicated that you guys had been drinking heavily that day.
I insinuated that some members of the party after rafting had gone to the store to get alcohol, I believe.
So is this your testimony that you hadn't been drinking that day?
No, it's my testimony that there was alcohol in the home. I had a few beers.
You had a few beers. Isn't it true that you sent an email to Ms. Redwine indicating that you did not remember what happened the night before?
I didn't remember everything. My face had just been smashed in.
But you have no idea what happened. You clearly...
I remember being in front of Mrs. Redwine's person. She was coming out of her bed and I was entering the room. We were no more than 2 feet apart. I remember that Mrs. Redwine had a baseball bat next to her bed that she used to defend herself in the event that somebody was to break into the home. and then I remember waking up on the couch.
And how do you describe that bat? As like one of those souvenir bats that you get?
No, I would describe it as more along the lines of a t-ball bat, where it's kind of for a beginner like Dylan might have been, which is why there was probably one in the home. So it would have been a short beginner baseball bat, so to speak, what I would call a t-ball bat.
And you indicated that you woke up from being unconscious. Would it be fair to say that you were passed out?
No.
Now, you indicated that you'd been working on your marriage with Ms. Redwine prior to that incident.
We were working together to move in a direction to reconcile our differences, yes.
Is it your testimony that it is prudent for Dylan to be in Cory's custodial care while Ms. Redwine is traveling for work?
I was only making the suggestion as an alternative to taking Dylan away from school. Obviously, I hadn't been communicated to that she was leaving. I hadn't been offered the ability to make arrangements to be there for Dylan.
Well, what I'm asking you...
In Dylan's interest to attend school. That was where that came from.
So it would be prudent to leave Dylan with Cory, correct?
It wouldn't be my first choice, but that was Mrs. Redwine's thing. I'm just saying it was an alternative for Mrs. Redwine.
But you...
I had no knowledge of the travel.
But you just described Dylan, or Cory rather, as being a druggie and an alcoholic.
I think that Cory has both attributes in his life. I think he has the attributes that can be very positive influences on Dylan, but I also think he has very negative attributes that can be very negative in his life. What I'm trying to explain to you, and allow me, if I may, that up until recently when I realized that Cory was doing drugs and alcohol in my home when I was away without my consent or knowledge, it then very well became an issue with Cory's involvement in drugs and alcohol. The days of school that Dylan had missed had been an entire year previous to that point, so I didn't realize that Cory at any point up until recently this summer that there was a potential for Cory to be involved in drugs and alcohol.
Are you aware that Cory obtained employment within 2 days of arriving in Colorado Springs?
No, I was not aware of that, but
Were you aware that he was employed here while he was still living in Durango?
I knew he was working for Western Technologies, yes.
Are you aware that both of those companies drug test?
Yeah, okay, I'm not aware of that, but it's not uncommon for this line of work that be the case because I undergo random drug testing frequently.
So it's your testimony that you weren't aware that Ms. Redwine was required to travel for work?
When we were married, Mrs. Redwine traveled for work. She also had the ability to make arrangements to fly to Denver, have the meeting, and be on a plane later that evening and be back in Durango the same night. So yes, I was aware that she traveled. But I was also aware of the fact that she could have done many of those trips within a one-day time frame.
Oh, you mean fly up and back the same day?
Fly out, early in the morning, get to her meeting, have her meeting that she had to do with whoever it was she was dealing with in Denver, and be on a plane out of Denver early enough to make it back to Durango that same evening, yes.
And during this time period, you had equal parenting time, correct?
Yes.
And did you ever make an effort to exercise equal parenting time?
I made every opportunity that I possibly could to spend as much time with Dylan as I possibly could.
How many times did you coordinate with Ms. Redwine as to her schedule for travel?
So are you asking me why I didn't ask Mrs. Redwine to plan and advance with me the dates that she had to travel?
No. What I'm saying is you're aware that she was required to travel for work, right?
When we were married, I knew she was required to travel for her job.
It's a simple yes or no.
Yes.
Thank you. And so when she was required to work, is it your testimony that she made no effort whatsoever to communicate with you from the beginning as to what her travel schedule would be, even with Ms. Sayers?
No.
During the period that's in question from the date that the last orders were issued until the present, did you work with Ms. Sayers, with Ms. Redwine, in any way to coordinate caring for Dylan during the time that Ms. Redwine was traveling?
No, I did not.
Okay. Did you exercise your equal parenting time? Week on, week off was the schedule, correct?
That's correct.
Did you exercise week on, week off from the last hearing when the last order was issued as to parenting time?
No, I did not.
Okay, so when it comes to questions about Dylan's attendance at school, would it be fair to say that both you and Ms. Redwine are responsible for ensuring that Dylan gets to school?
I would agree with that, yes.
And as a joint parent, a joint decision maker, you had full access to all records pertaining to Dylan, correct?
Yes.
And did you ever request once any records regarding Dylan's academics from the school?
Not from school. I had asked Mrs. Redwine on...
And when Ms. Redwine allegedly refused to provide them to you, did you ever call the school?
No, because when we...
Did you ever?
No, I did not.
And when you claim that Ms. Redwine interfered with your parenting time, did you ever bring a legal action before the court, insisting that the court order be enforced by the court?
No, I did not.
And when Ms. Redwine was allegedly interfering with your telephone contact, did you ever bring a motion before the court insisting enforcement of the court order?
No, I did not.
You claim that Ms. Redwine has had a drug problem, a substance abuse problem, and that's what led to your divorce. You entered into a parenting time agreement, correct?
That's correct.
You stipulated to equal parenting time with Ms. Redwine, correct?
That's correct.
And for 3 years, you decided that you were going to be absent from the picture so that you could, if I might find a quote, so that you could give her her space and not interfere with the day-to-day needs of the children.
That's not my... I never would use that kind of language, I don't believe.
May I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
If you could take a look at that, please. This bottom portion here, is that an email from you that you sent to Ms. Redwine?
This bottom portion, is that...
And it's CC'd to your attorney?
That's correct.
Okay, right here, would you read from that I forward?
But I think you gotta look at the whole email as a whole, and address all of it. I don't think that's the intent in which I meant that to be determined, but...
Okay. Well, let's revisit.
What I'm saying is if you look at the context of the email as a whole, you know, I'm trying to address the fact that Dylan is missing a lot of time in school, and I also am trying to address the fact that both of the parents are responsible in that. And so because at this point Dylan is in the primary care of his mother because I am working out of town, not by my choice, it's out of necessity that I think there's a certain amount of diligence that needs to be followed here.
Okay. Now let's talk about that. You're working out of town not by choice, but by necessity. You testified that, and when you were criticizing Ms. Redwine for her travels, and testified that you were severely distraught about Dylan's absence from school, that you wouldn't do the job if it meant that it interfered with Dylan. So you have equal parenting time, correct?
That's correct.
You're equally responsible for the upbringing of your child, at least on a week-on, week-off basis, correct?
Okay, yes, I agree.
Okay, so you say that your inability to provide for the care of your child has to do with the fact that you work, correct?
That's correct.
Yet you're criticizing Ms. Redwine for Dylan's absenteeism from school because she has to travel for work, correct?
We both have to travel for work, so yes, I agree.
You indicate that you would be able to ensure that Dylan gets to school every day, correct?
That's correct.
How many days in the last 3 years have you ensured that Dylan made it to school on time?
Every time that he was with me, I ensured that he got to school. Which was, I don't have an accurate number, but any night that Dylan was with me in which he had school the next day, more often than not, I didn't just take him to the school bus and drop him off. I took him to school and dropped him off at the school.
Okay, and And what responsibility have you taken in the last 3 years to ensure that your child isn't going down a wrong road?
I try to communicate with him in every way I possibly can.
What about being there as an equal parent that you stipulated to back in 2009? That's what you fought for, and that's what you agreed to. So why now do you think that the court should believe, when you've had equal parenting time all this time, why should the court now believe that you're going to be the sole parent, the primary parent?
Because I think that in these 3 years that one thing that Mrs. Redwine and I have always agreed, and it has never come into play, is that we would use our kids against each other. And I think that as parents, if we can't put aside our differences for each other, that we should be able to at least do that in the interest of our children. And I think over and over, I've tried to demonstrate my ability to do that. I've tried to communicate with Mrs. Redwine, and I got nowhere. I tried to communicate with Dylan, and I'm hearing the same thing from him that I heard from Cory. Oh, I'm doing fine, things are going well, all these kinds of things. Now I find out that school contacts me because they can't get a hold of Mrs. Redwine, that he's missed 34 days of school. I had no knowledge of that information.
You had access to that information. You had the ability.
Mic drop. For all his concerns and whatever way he presents his side of the story, Mark had just been owned by Elaine's lawyer, and it was about to happen again. When his attorney had his chance to respond to the questioning, it was all he could do to try and clean up the mess, but it didn't work. After Mark's questioning, they moved into closing arguments. Here's what Miss Harrison said.
All right. The statute requires the court to consider a list of factors that are set forth in 14-10-129. Specifically, the reasons why the party is wishing to relocate, the reason why the other party is opposing, history and quality of relationship. The court can read those factors. I think we made sure to cover each and every one of those in that Ms. Redwine specifically testified that she's made a good faith effort to try and make a go of it in La Plata County. And it's, if the court were to recall or go back to review the case file or transcripts, since March 17th of 2010, when we had the hearing on the motion pursuant to a Rule 60B, at that time, Ms. Redwine was struggling financially and made it very clear to the court, which the court did acknowledge in its findings and rulings, that she is struggling and she could not do it out here. She did make a good faith effort to maintain the home that she was awarded in the divorce, and found that it became an impossibility having to turn the property over to Mr. Redwine in a concession as to a division of the marital assets and debt. In addition, Ms. Redwine testified that when she originally decided to go up to northern Colorado, the Denver, Florence, Colorado Springs area, it was because at that point her mother was older and needed assistance in maintaining the home, and that her sister, who had been doing that historically, had decided to move to Phoenix. After Ms. Redwine moved up to that area, she learned that her mother did, in fact, have stage 4 small cell cancer, and which is even more of a reason why she needs to stay there and relocate with the minor child. It's also her reason why she's had to change her residence, which she originally had with her mother, and has made temporary arrangements to reside with her significant other, Mr. Hall, in the interim, pending the court's decision. The courts have also explored Mr. Redwine's objection to the relocation, and it's unclear. Mr. Redwine has failed to exercise parenting time, exercise any of his rights as a co-parent, an equal parent, joint decision maker for the 3 years. And so he's objecting that because he didn't know how bad the situation was, now that she's decided to relocate, he thinks that, objecting to the relocation would put the minor child in his care. It's become apparent that Mr. Redwine has had minimal visitation with Dylan. And most of that has to do with his, according to his testimony, his work-related travel. Dylan was absent from school. Ms. Redwine testified that even when there were anticipated trips where she would have to take Dylan out of school, that she worked with the teachers to obtain his homework ahead of time and, worked to make sure that he did his homework while they were traveling. So I don't think it could be clearly said that his lack of progress in school was entirely due to Ms. Redwine, and may, in fact, be due partly to the fact he simply didn't like school. I think we've heard testimony that Mr. Redwine has no extended family in the La Plata County or surrounding areas. Neither does Ms. Redwine. A majority of her family members are located up in the Denver, Colorado Springs, Florence area, and they have provided a substantial support basis for her, and also are an intricate part of Dylan's life. I don't think there's any dispute that, and I think Mr. Redwine actually acknowledged that at least for the last 3 years, if not more, Ms. Redwine has been the primary caregiver. And given the lack of consistent interaction with Mr. Redwine, the advantage is that he would maintain the status quo, continue to live with the parent who raised him all this time, and have parenting time with Mr. Redwine. It would appear that Mr. Redwine, while he's historically, and I think in his own testimony admits that he's raised the issue of Ms. Redwine's alcohol use and drug use, and his admission that he entered into a stipulation giving her equal parenting time, which he could have contested, and in addition, basically left the children with her for 3 years unsupervised, unattended by what he is trying to claim is some druggy addict alcoholic. He claims that the appropriate thing for Ms. Redwine to do when she was traveling would be to leave Dylan with Cory, whom he describes as a druggy alcoholic. So it's Mr. Redwine would like to put the burden of doing all of this on everybody else, and then find fault with them when there seems to be a problem that arises, without taking any responsibility. He had equal parenting time, equal decision-making, full access to everything that he needed to maintain some monitoring over his son's academics and any other area he was concerned about, and yet he didn't. And now he sits there and points a finger at everybody else, when Ms. Redwine has done everything in her power to stay afloat. She's had to forego and give up things that were very important to her, just so she could make ends meet, all while raising his children and paying him child support. And to sit here and have him criticize, it's an abomination to the court.
Thank you, Your Honor. Well, as to how someone who has $80,000 salary comes close to losing the home and being so far behind on propane that there's risk of it being cut off, we'll save that for January. Mr. Redwine, again, was not advocating, never did advocate, that the appropriate person to leave Dylan with while Miss Redwine was traveling would be Cory. However, There was a possibility that he could have been left with a caregiver, but Miss Redwine herself said, "Gee, I never thought of that." Mr. Redwine is asking to be given a chance now to be the primary parent, to prove to this court that he can help save Dylan. And Mr. Redwine is absolutely taking responsibility. He took responsibility on the stand. Now he wants to be responsible for making sure that his son goes to school and what happened last year doesn't happen this year. Mr. Redwine was rebuffed by Miss Redwine. There was no proof of any grades that Dylan has had in Lewis Palmer School. Nothing was presented to the court. The only thing that was presented to the court was Dylan's dismal attendance record last year while he was under the primary care of Miss Redwine. Again, there was abundant testimony that Mr. Redwine had no knowledge when Miss Redwine was going to travel. She herself said she never told Mr. Redwine when she was going to travel, so how can Mr. Redwine be expected to make arrangements for Dylan while Miss Redwine was going to travel? Economic circumstances certainly affected both of these parties. Neither party should be penalized for choosing to work and try to put food and provide their children with shelter. Mr. Redwine testified that there was this issue that has been brought up. Why would you give 50-50 if you think Miss Redwine is an alcoholic or a drug addict? Well, Mr. Redwine answered that question. He said, "I thought she was done with that. There was no indication to the contrary. Nobody told me anything about what was going on in that house. I had no way of knowing." Dylan was actually doing well in school the year prior, but now, the pattern that we saw with Cory, the older child, is starting to repeat itself down with the younger child. This is where Mr. Redwine is asking the court, let him step in. Let him be the primary parent so that Dylan doesn't follow down the same path that his older brother did, that which Mrs. Redwine seems to be allowing. Seems to be. You know, he had bad grades last year. She was the one that was closest to be able to monitor that situation. She was closest to be able to monitor the poor attendance. As a matter of fact, it was through her actions Dylan had poor attendance, and therefore the bad grades last year. Mrs. Redwine has been alienating Dylan from father and father from Dylan. We need to give father and son a chance to build on a relationship, build a bond between father and son, and the way to do that is to provide Mr. Redwine the chance to, and the opportunity to have Dylan through the school year. The fact that Mrs. Redwine has been Dylan's primary parent and been in his life and been in care and control, that's exactly the problem. Dylan is starting to slip. He's starting again to go down the same path as Cory. This appears to be Dylan's chance to be with his dad. It's too late for Cory. It's not too late for Dylan to be with his dad, who will make him go to school. Mrs. Redwine clearly has shown the court she's incapable of doing that. Mr. Redwine will see that Dylan gets counseling. Dylan has never had counseling. He absolutely needs counseling. Mr. Redwine, having Dylan for the school year, will put Dylan in a situation that he'll be able to get the counseling he so desperately needs, and frankly deserves. Mr. Redwine will now be able to monitor Dylan's grades, be able to monitor his attendance, be able to monitor his activities to ensure that he doesn't become an alcoholic or a drug addict based on what he's been exposed to. That's a very real possibility. Again, as Mr. Redwine stated, Dylan has seen more than most 12 or 13-year-olds have. And because of what he's seen and what he's been exposed to, he needs to go live with Mr. Redwine. This is not about what Dylan wants or doesn't want. Although the court obviously is going to consider that because you interviewed Dylan. This is what's in Dylan's best interest, and we came very close here. If not, and perhaps we did even reach an endangerment standard here, Your Honor. I know this is a best interest standard, but we came very close, if not went over the endangerment standard. Dylan has been exposed to alcohol and drug use in the home at Mrs. Redwine. We need to take him out of that situation and put him in Mr. Redwine's home so that Dylan has a chance this coming school year, and frankly, for the rest of his life.
It's time for the court's decision. Judge Dickinson says, quote, "Okay, what I'm going to do is I won't keep the parties in suspense. I'll tell them what my end result's going to be, and then I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what concerns I have. I'm going to grant the motion. My concerns are, I think, the evidence regarding drug use or alcohol use by Cory or Dylan, and I don't have jurisdiction over Cory, are speculative to some extent and certainly circumstantial. I do want to address it. I also want to address the counseling issue, but let me first make findings. I think the standard that applies is best interest. By all accounts, although there is a 50-50 parenting time order in effect, Miss Redwine has actually been the primary parent since that order. I think if the status of the case law is you look at the last order and not what the parties have actually done, and I would note that it would have been an even higher standard that Mr. Redwine would have to meet were I to decide that the majority time parent rule control. Ability to prioritize the needs of the child ahead of one's own needs in subparagraph 9 under 129-2-C. I think the relevant factors with regard to Miss Redwine's reason for relocation, I would think that certainly her relationship with Mr. Hall, I believe it is a factor in the equation, but I think she does have some valid reasons for needing to relocate. In particular, the lack of any family support. I will note that Dylan is not relocating to unfamiliar territory. By all accounts, he has visited the Front Range, the extended family, for many years. By everyone's testimony, Miss Redwine has been the de facto majority time parent. I think one of the problems I have with what Mr. Redwine is asking me to do is that I haven't been shown that he has any practical method for accomplishing that. His job requires him to travel for extended periods, and at the present time, he wouldn't be here for Dylan even if I were to make him the majority time parent. With regard to my interview with Dylan, I'm not going to say a great deal. That was kind of a mixed bag. In some respects, I think Dylan is mature enough to enter a reason. Independent preference, in some respects, he's not. For example, when he talked about which school he would rather go to, I find his reason for choosing one over the other to be fairly juvenile. I don't know that that's a terribly mature analysis on his part, but in some respects, he is a fairly mature young man, and so I'm giving some weight to what he had to say. In regards to Cory, and he does have a significant relationship with Cory, I will also note that although I don't think it's the controlling factor here, he does have extended family in the Colorado Springs area. He does not in Durango. If that were the only thing I were looking at, I don't think it would tip the scale necessarily, but I think it goes along with the other finding. Mr. Redwine says that his relationship with Cory has both positive and negative aspects. On balance, I think that looking at everything, I think it probably is in Dylan's best interest to maintain that relationship. I will note that despite Mr. Redwine's concerns about Cory having dropped out of school, he's gotten his GED and by all accounts has good jobs or has a good job. I've already said that I think the evidence regarding the alleged drug and alcohol use is circumstantial and speculative. I am very concerned about the absences he had last year. I think looking at it in hindsight that Miss Redwine made a poor choice in not trying to make some sort of definite arrangement. Conflict in the testimony as to whether any attempt was made to notify Mr. Redwine, I think certainly he probably didn't have as much knowledge of what was going on as he should have. But who's responsible for that? I'm not sure. Miss Redwine said he was never available. He said nobody ever called me. I don't know. I just do think this points out the party's inability to communicate. I'm going to order that neither party is to criticize or belittle the other parent to the minor child. I think they agreed to that in the original stipulation, as I recall. But I think that's very important. And I will tell you that there is some evidence in front of the court that gives me concern about whether that's happened. Going back 2 factors I've already mentioned, I think Dylan, because he has visited there, has a good adjustment to both communities. Probably a little better to Bayfield, though. I think it's more with his friends than school, perhaps. The pattern of past involvement I've talked about, the proximity I've talked about. I think on balance, Miss Redwine has a little bit better ability to prioritize Dylan's needs. Next time on Negligence, the Dylan Redwine story.
Just in tonight, we're hearing from one of the last people to talk to Dylan Redwine.
It's where we meet Ryan Nava.
We made plans to hang out, and yeah, I was looking forward to it.
The friend that was supposed to meet up with Dylan on the day the 13-year-old disappeared.
I told him, you can stay, or you can, as in you can stay the night. And we will get home around 8 or 9, and I'm referring to at night. He randomly just changed his plan. He said, "Can't come, sorry, I'll hang tomorrow." And I told him, okay. I asked him, "Did your dad say no?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Oh, okay." He asked can I come over early, like 6:30 early tomorrow? And I expected him to be there or to wake up by him knocking on that sliding door. And thought it was a little weird. Thought it was weird that he was not there because I know he wanted to hang out, and I wanted to hang out with him too.
Then you mentioned the text message to him at 6:46 a.m. on November 19th. What do you text Dylan?
"Where are you?" And later I told him, "Dude, you need to call somebody, anybody, as soon as possible. We all worried about you. Your mom called and she's worried, bro. Seriously, and down another text, I told him, seriously, when you get the message, call someone." I just wanted him to really call somebody because something was not right.
And did Dylan tell you his thoughts on where he wanted to live?
Yes, he did.
And what did he tell you?
He wanted to live with his mother. Clear that Dylan didn't want to go visit with his father, just based on things that I had seen. He was not comfortable around his father. He disclosed to me that he had seen the pictures that creeped him out and made him feel very uncomfortable.
Now, I want to talk specifically about that visit. Were you asked legal advice?
Yes, I was.
Were you asked about whether Dylan did or did not have to go on that trip?
Yes, I was.
What were you asked?
I was asked if there was any options to putting Dylan on the plane.
Who asked you?
Miss.
Based on the question you were asked, did you have to give Ms. Hall a response as to whether or not Dylan had to get on that airplane?
I did give her legal advice.
What did you tell her? Take your time, ma'am, and there are tissues to relax things out.
I told her that she had to put Dylan on the plane or she would be charged with contempt of court.